We are live if you're watching on Tuesday, June 23rd, and there will be an opportunity to call in with your questions or comments later on in the program. You can submit them anytime via email to arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. This evening, we will take a look at housing and the ways it has been affected by events in this first half of 2020. With me are Mr. Bill Huang, Housing Director for the City of Pasadena, and Mr. Charles Loveman, Executive Director of Heritage Housing Partners. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here this evening. I'd like to ask each of you to please take a moment to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself. Bill, let's begin with you.
Sure. I'm the Housing Director for the City of Pasadena, and my department oversees affordable housing development. Also, we run a Section 8 program to help people who need assistance in paying their rent, and homeless programs, and some funding for nonprofit organizations, and an endowment, and a social enterprise also. So we do all of that.
And Charles, you'd tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm the Executive Director of Heritage Housing Partners. HHP is a nonprofit affordable housing developer based in Pasadena. We will be celebrating our 22nd anniversary in September.
Mr. Loveman, can I stop you for just a moment? I apologize. There seems to be some problem with the placement of your microphone, and we are having a difficult time hearing you.
Is this better?
That's better, yes.
Okay, I'll do it this way. So I'm the Executive Director of Heritage Housing Partners, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer based in Pasadena. We were founded in 1998. We are a home ownership developer, affordable home ownership. So we build and sell housing units to low, moderate, and middle income households. And most of our projects are located here in Pasadena.
Okay, fantastic. Gentlemen, again, thank you so much for being here this evening. And again, there will be an opportunity for the public to call in and ask some questions a little later on in the program. But let's begin. Number one, there's been an increase in the homeless population. And of course, that's happening throughout the country. But it seems to be a very large issue in the Southern California area and in Pasadena. That was exacerbated by COVID-19. And many have been displaced since then. How do you respond to that situation?
Well, thank you, Joe. As most people can see, the homeless numbers in the county overall have been increasing. They released their annual count number just last week, and it was up 13% over the previous year. And but in Pasadena, our numbers have been slightly lower. We're 3% down from the previous year, and so we know those counts were done pre-pandemic. So we know that the pandemic has some very adverse effects on those who are on the brink of homelessness or at risk of homelessness, and so there's a lot of things that are concerning us right now. The economic job loss. The majority of people who are experiencing homelessness are homeless because of economic reasons. So the fact that people are losing jobs or losing income, that's a big concern that puts their housing at risk. And there was also a recognized need to decompress the existing homeless shelters here in Los Angeles County and in Pasadena. We have some homeless shelters here, to decompress them to allow for social distancing in the shelter facility. And so that has effectively reduced the capacity of these shelters by about 2/3. So those are all very concerning. But the solution to homelessness remains the same, and that is housing. Right? Permanent housing is the only thing that ends homelessness. And so we need to continue to produce more affordable permanent housing. But there are things in the short term that we had to do very, very quickly. For instance, we had to move those who are at risk of getting COVID and dying of COVID, we had to move them very quickly out of the shelters, off of the streets, and into a motel. And so we did that. We and some of our community partners. So we moved about 110 individuals into different motels and hotels. These are not people who had COVID, but who were at risk that if they got COVID, it would be it could be very, very bad for them, very dangerous for them. So these are people who are seniors and who have underlying health conditions. So we did that. We set up some mobile showers. We set up hand washing stations. You know, the stay-at-home order is called safer at home, right? But if you don't have a home, what does that mean, right? And so we had to try to compensate for that with better hygiene and a way for people to be social distance. And then moving forward, right, we want to ramp up our program called homeless prevention to prevent people from falling into homelessness, and as well as increase our emergency shelter housing by utilizing motel vouchers to increase the number of beds or units that are available for emergency housing.
Mr. Loveman, I wonder if you have an opinion to weigh in on this as well.
Well, we do not, we don't serve homeless individuals as part of our program. The only thing I could to add is that I think affordable housing is a problem that affects a wide range of households, from folks who don't have housing, the homeless, all the way up to middle income families who are priced out of Pasadena and other high expensive markets. So, I think part of the solution is everything that Bill is doing. The other part of the solution is build more housing across the wide spectrum of need, and that we're trying to do that part.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the homeless population is growing across the country. Probably nowhere is it more extreme than on the West Coast and in the Southern California region. Those numbers began to rise long before we heard anything about COVID. In fact, many experts have traced the before seen numbers of homeless people back to the economic meltdown in 2007. However, the economic shutdown of 2020 has certainly caused the numbers to explode beyond anything we'd ever imagined. And there has been talk of perhaps a second wave of the COVID-19 virus come the fall. In fact, there are concerns that we may be seeing a rise already, as news media outlets have been reporting that LA County has been posting new infections at a rate of about 2,000 per day for the last 3 days. And that has fueled discussion and fears that we may see another economic shutdown as people are forced to go back to shelter at home, that the reopenings of the cities may have to stop and, for want of a better term, reverse. That having been said, the potential for even greater numbers of homeless becomes more and more possible. Is Pasadena prepared to see an even greater influx of homeless?
I'd say that there are never enough resources. You can never be prepared enough. I think the response to the first, to the initial wave of COVID was pretty successful here in Pasadena with respect to the homeless. Again, we took about 20% of our overall homeless population, and we were able to move them into motels so that they can be social distanced. We recognize that that places where people could wash their hands, could clean up, were shut down, and so we very quickly stood up mobile shower programs, public hand washing stations, handed out hundreds of hygiene kits, and we also implemented a eviction moratorium so that households who couldn't pay their rent or couldn't pay all of their rent would not be evicted for non-payment of rent if they had if their inability to pay rent was due to COVID. And so we did that very quickly. And there are some some additional things that we are doing. We are getting ready to launch a emergency rental assistance program funded at $1 million. And what this would do is, the way the eviction moratorium worked was that during the emergency period, if a household, rental household, could not pay some or all of their rent, they couldn't be evicted. They'd have to notify their landlord that they couldn't pay and why they couldn't pay. And so during the emergency period, they wouldn't have to pay their rent or all of their rent. But then when the emergency period is lifted, and we don't know when that will be, we're still under the emergency period, but when it gets lifted, they would have 6 months to pay their back rent. And so we recognize that many households before COVID happened were living paycheck to paycheck. And so if they temporarily lost their income, but then they got their income back again, it would be difficult for them to catch up on their back rent. And so we're getting ready to roll out a program where households can receive $4,500 grant to pay for their back rent, and help to get that burden off of them so that they can be more secure in their housing moving forward, and won't be evicted for non-payment of rent 6 months after the emergency period is lifted.
My next question naturally would have to be, since Pasadena is generally among the higher rent incomes and higher costs of living, is that going to be enough to help people moving forward?
Excuse me. Well, it's like I said, it'll be $1 million, and I think that's a very healthy beginning. Some of the, and it'll be recognizing that rents are high here in Pasadena. $4,500 can pay for $4,500 for 3 months of back rent is the number where we've landed. Some other, like the county's program, is at $1,000 a month, so $3,000 is the max we get. So ours is a little bit higher, recognizing the need. Is it enough? Well, no. I'm sure that the program will be oversubscribed, but at this point, that's where we're starting at. And I think City Council will see how the program goes and then decide whether they want to put more money into it. The City Council is doing a number of things, right? They're funding meals programs and giving emergency grants to our food pantries to address food insecurity issues. They're rolling out a business assistance program to provide grants for small businesses. The need is very, very broad, and the city is acting pretty quickly to address a number of areas. But I wouldn't say that it's going to remove all of the economic pain and economic loss due to COVID. The pandemic has caused a lot of economic hardship.
Well, it has been recognized that Pasadena has lost a fair amount of population due to those high rents that we were just speaking of. Are there plans to recoup any of that population? Specifically, are there plans to make it feasible for lower income residents to come into Pasadena, possibly when things return a little bit more to normal?
Charles, you want to address it from your standpoint?
Yeah, so I think I want to go back to one thing you said, Joe, where the beginning of the homeless crisis started in the fallout of the 2008 sort of recession, which was a housing-driven Great Recession. And one of the things that we saw, and you look at the data going back the last 12 years, is that the private market stopped producing housing, both rental and for sale housing, for middle-income families. And so what you see is the private market building housing for the upper end and the public sector providing housing for the lower end. And middle income, basically, they're still where they were 10 years ago, which is to say that the normal sort of process of folks leaving their apartment and going and getting a first-time home that was affordable to low and moderate middle folks, that just isn't happening anymore. And so the rental inventory is just tied up, and it has this impact at folks at the bottom of getting pushed out of the rental inventory and creating homelessness. So while Bill's talking about the immediate things that need to be done, and I think the city needs to be complimented for all the things they are doing, there needs to be a longer-term strategy about, okay, how are we going to fit? It took 12 years to get here. What are we going to do over the next 5 to 10 years to try and reverse the trend that we're on?
Yeah, I'd say I'm sorry, Charles. Yeah, I would say,
I think it's more housing across the board.
Right,
exactly. Is the answer.
Exactly. The fundamental cause of the housing crisis is that housing costs, if we're talking about rents, but also mortgages, that housing costs have been increasing at a much faster rate than incomes. And so people are having a harder time, and this is going on for years. This is not just a one-time occurrence, but this is years and years of housing costs increasing at a much faster rate than incomes, and that results in households not being able to afford the housing anymore. And so what needs to happen is housing needs to be produced. Lots of housing needs to be produced where the rent increases are tied to the income increases. So if the median income in Pasadena or in LA County goes up 2%, well, rents also can only go up 2%. They can't have 2% increases in incomes and 20% increases in rents. That's how we ended up in this situation. So we need a lot of housing where the housing costs, the rents, or the mortgage payments are tied to the incomes of people, long-term and always tied together. So those two track each other and they don't diverge, resulting in folks who just can't afford to maintain their housing anymore.
I think that's a key observation, that the cost of home ownership is outpacing incomes. But that begs an interesting question. Is this happening as a result of a simple supply and demand issue? Is it just that there aren't enough homes and that is what's causing the price to skyrocket? Or are there other forces at work here?
Well, I think that the lack of supply is definitely a big part of the issue. But there's also the incomes have stagnated. So for many households, there's a lack of middle class jobs, and so there are income. We need to boost incomes. We need to create jobs that pay good wages that people can actually live on. I think that's why you've seen some efforts to increase the minimum wage. Of course, that's minimum wage. It's not a middle income wage, but it's a minimum wage. So yeah, I think there are lots of reasons why, but the lack of supply is a big issue.
And I think the lack of supply, another way to think of it is lack of demand, because if it costs you, so just to give you an example, we built a project called Fair Oaks Court on Fair Oaks, just south of Orange Grove. It was completed 12 years ago. It cost under $500,000 per unit to build a unit, what they call total development costs, which is land costs, construction costs, permits, architecture, property taxes, everything, all in, including a profit for a nonprofit. So around $500,000 12 years ago. It's costing almost $700,000 for us to build the same unit in Pasadena. Not because land costs have gone up, but concrete costs have gone up, steel costs have gone up, lumber costs have gone up. The tariff foolishness that our current president embarked on caused a huge spike in materials costs. If it costs you $700,000 to build a housing unit, as a real estate developer, you look at the market. There aren't that many people who can pay $700,000 per housing unit. So the lack of supply and the lack of demand go hand in hand. There are many, many people, tens of thousands, if not millions of people who, could afford a $500,000 house, a $550,000 house, but no one can afford to build one because it costs more than that. So I think it's the two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Joe, I think the point here is, if we want to prevent people from getting displaced, from getting priced out, there has to be housing that they can afford. There has to be housing. Otherwise, they have no other choice. They have to move to a lower cost area. So providing more affordable housing really helps to dampen this displacement trend. So it's a real important solution, part of the solution.
Well, certainly the types of materials, the cost of materials that go into the construction of a home have gone up. And as Charles noted, there are forces at work that rest firmly in the government's hands. But what about the style or the expectation of current constructions? It seems that gone are the days of the modest 3-bedroom home that was 12 or 1,400 square feet. Now, most new construction, at least in a lot of the areas where development is taking place, are much, much larger, to the tune of 5 bedrooms and 300,000 square feet. How much does that play into the cost of building homes these days?
Well, again, I think that if we could build a 1,200 square foot 3-bedroom unit, it might be in a condominium configuration as opposed to a single family detached. But if we could build that for 500 grand, we would sell units all day long without any kind of financial assistance from the city. I think the product that's being built is because only folks at the high end can afford to be buyers.
Bill,
And by the way, if you look at the affordability, like you said, homelessness is occurring everywhere throughout the United States. But if you look at the affordability of other cities around the country, Nashville, Dallas, Austin, Denver, many, many cities, and you look at what the median income is and can someone who makes the median income afford to purchase the medium priced home? In all those cities, they can. In LA and San Francisco, we cannot. The median income in LA County pays about 2/3 of a house, or 2/3 of a house. So we have a problem that's unique to California.
All right. Bill, I was wondering if you had anything to add to that last question about the types of construction that are
when we look at the challenges of building cost-effective housing, one of the things that we've had to look at is this matter of density, that you need to build more units on a single lot in order to basically divvy up that land cost amongst more units. When we build affordable housing, or when developers build affordable housing, they oftentimes have to build at a much higher quality. In order to get neighborhood acceptance, they oftentimes have to build at less than the maximum density. Again, that makes the numbers more difficult on a per unit basis. And when we talk about something like, we have 2 projects in our development pipeline right now that are permanent supportive housing projects. These are projects for folks who have been chronically homeless. You have to provide a lot of common area. You have to provide a lot of counseling spaces, community spaces, outdoor spaces that you don't oftentimes see in a market rate project. And so, and then a lot of times, because you're using the public dollars, then there are certain wage rates that you have to pay, as opposed to a private developer who could pay, whatever the lowest wages they can find somebody to do the job. On these publicly funded projects, you can't do that. And we are also seeing that, for instance, the affordable housing industry is very much at the cutting edge of sustainability, of environmental design. Some of the some of the greenest buildings in Pasadena are our affordable housing apartments, right? Well, it costs money to make them that green, but that's a requirement to score enough points in these funding scenarios that in order to compete well in for these funding sources, you get points for being very environmental, and so developers do that. But it keeps the cost keeps creeping up, so it's expensive. Affordable housing, the cost to rent it or the cost to buy the unit is affordable. The cost to build it is not necessarily affordable. The cost is as much as other developers, if not even higher.
So you're saying that some of the environmentally friendly requirements that have been put in place in recent years are directly affecting the ability to produce affordable housing by escalating the costs involved in construction.
Well, it's even more than what the standard requirements are. The funding sources for affordable housing oftentimes have green criteria above and beyond what the code requires. And so you either are required to meet those, or you need to meet those in order to score enough points. And so, if you're familiar with the LEED certification program for green buildings, LEED Platinum is the highest level, and we have at least 2 or 3 of our affordable housing apartments that are at the LEED Platinum level. This is the highest level there is, far beyond what the code requires.
Well, okay, at the risk of getting too political for just a second, the current administration has made it plain that they would like to roll back a lot of the environmental protections that have been put in place over the years by various previous presidents. Do you think that's a viable solution to the housing crisis currently?
I don't think it's not going to make up the difference between what people can afford and the cost of housing. No.
Okay, fair enough. All right. I know we kind of wandered off topic just a little bit by discussing all of this. Originally, we were talking about the feasibility of low income residents in the Pasadena area. Are there plans for that in the future?
Yeah, we have quite a robust pipeline right now for these are projects that are under construction or in the process of getting their city approvals or pulled together their financing. Currently, we have 755 units of affordable housing. These are long-term, deed-restricted housing, the kind of housing where the incomes and the rent increases are tied together. So we have 755 units in the pipeline. They include 132 units that are affordable home ownership units. That's the kind that Charles and his nonprofit build. In fact, most of those 132 are his projects, so are his units. And but we have 623 affordable rental units, and all the way from folks who are permanent housing for chronically homeless individuals, all the way up to sort of moderate income households. So that's a lot, but is it enough? I know you're going to ask me that, Joe, because you always ask, is that enough? It's like, well, no, we need to do more. We do need to do more.
Okay. If I can interrupt the flow of the conversation for just a moment, I would like to take an opportunity to point out that now is the point in the program where we normally open up the phone lines to viewers at home. If you have a question or comment, you can certainly call in. That telephone number is area code 951-356-6882. Again, that's 951-356-6882. It is also possible to comment through the Zoom chat. And of course, you can email us at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. Okay. I'm wondering if you gentlemen could give us an update on the situation with the street homeless, and perhaps more specifically about Project Room Key.
Mm-hmm. So Project Room Key is a program that was started at the state level specifically for COVID, in response to COVID, which is to move individuals who are vulnerable to COVID, those who are elderly and those with underlying health conditions, to move them off the streets or out of congregate shelters and into motel rooms temporarily, so that they can be more isolated and more protected and have less chance of contracting COVID. So that's kind of the basic concept. Pasadena, we actually started doing that. We and our nonprofit partners actually started doing that about a month before Project Roomkey actually was launched. But so we've been doing that. We housed about 110 elderly individuals and those with underlying health conditions into a handful of different hotels and motels here in Pasadena. And they receive 3 meals a day. Their motel stay is paid for. There's case management services there. There's housing assistance to get them into permanent housing because they're in there, temporarily. And that represents about 20% of our overall homeless population. So it's been going pretty well for the last several weeks now. We have been shifting from moving people into the motels to start to purposefully move them out. A handful of the individuals that have been in motels have already been found permanent housing. About several dozen of them have housing rental vouchers, and they need assistance in actually finding a unit that they can use, where they can use their voucher. So we're in the kind of wind down mode. We hope over the next month or so, 6 weeks to a month, that we'll wind the program down, and folks will have some other longer term housing solutions.
Was it difficult for you to find businesses to help you in support of Project Roomkey? Specifically where those hotels were concerned, or were there quite a few willing to step up?
I would say we had maybe a few more hotel operators that were willing to help us than we needed, but not a lot. Not a lot. We had a few more. So yes, it was not easy to find motel operators to work with us. Fortunately, as we know, the hospitality industry, hotels, motels, they've had huge vacancy rates there, and so some motel owners shut down altogether, and some decided to reach out to us or to be responsive to us and work with us, and so it's been a pretty successful program.
Well, certainly in some areas where we have seen the Project Roomkey employed, there has been kickback from residents in the communities. Was that the case in Pasadena, or was everybody pretty happy to see this operation in progress?
No, we didn't have any large public outcry. This opposition to almost any kind of housing for homeless individuals is unfortunately pretty common. I know when we were doing a project or a proposed project, we're talking to neighbors and business owners about a proposed project for permanent housing for formerly homeless individuals. The business, one of the neighboring business owners said, what are you going to do when they come and they set up a tent in front of my business? It's like, well, they won't do that because they will have their own housing unit. What do you do if they're going to, use my parking lot as their bathroom? It's like, they're not. Why would they do that? They will have their own bathroom. They won't do that. And so, actually, housing individuals who are experiencing homelessness is something that improves the quality of life in a neighborhood. It doesn't detract from the quality of life in the neighborhood. It improves it. And we've seen this again and again. People are no longer, if you give them housing or to provide them with housing, they're not sleeping in the public way, in the parks and on sidewalks and in the alleys. they're not doing that anymore because they have a place. They're using the bathroom. They're able to maintain good hygiene. They're able to stabilize their health and their mental health and substance use disorders. They're able to stabilize those things, and the result is an improved quality of life for everybody, not just that individual, but for everybody.
All right. Well, I'd like to get back to that in a moment. However, we do have a question that came in via our chat. It's from a viewer who writes, I'd like to see more tall buildings in Pasadena. I think the downtown area can hold them, and it seems like it would cut costs. So why are all of the buildings in the downtown area 10 stories or less?
Well, that's a question for our planning department and our planning director. They create plans for different areas, including the downtown area, and they include certain height limits. And but as to why the height limits aren't higher than they already are, I will tell you that there are plenty of people who feel like they're too high, and some, like the viewer, feels like they're not high enough. So could be that the planning department got it just right, but that's really a question for the planning department.
Okay. All right. Well, going back to our discussion just a moment ago, where we were talking about the Project Room Key and housing the homeless in communities, and where we have seen community concerns, one of those has certainly been the pandemic, the COVID-19 virus, and fears that all of these homeless people coming in are likely infected, not likely to follow the restrictions, and may result in a mass spreading of the pandemic. How do you address those issues?
Well, I would say that if they were left out in the streets, that very well could be the case. But once they are put into motels, that they have a much firstly, the individuals that we put in the motels are not COVID positive. We put them in the house proactively to prevent them from contracting COVID. And so they're in there, they have the care that they need, they have medical care also. In Project Room Key in LA County, individuals are medically checked 3 times a day. That doesn't happen if they're out on the streets or in the alleys or in the under the overpasses. So getting them into an environment where you can stabilize them, where they can maintain good hygiene, some of the key preventative measures for preventing COVID were things that people who are out on the streets can't do. Like, for instance, stay home when you're sick. Well, if you don't have a home, how do you do that? Wash your hands often. How are you supposed to do that? There's it's called safer at home, right? But if you're not home, you can't maintain those practices. And so by putting them into motels, we enable them to be able to follow those measures that we know help to prevent the spread of COVID. And I can tell you that it's been very successful amongst the folks that we have housed. It's been very successful. There hasn't been a COVID outbreak. There hasn't been a major spreading event there. So it's been very successful.
Well, that certainly does sound like a win-win for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
What is the general feeling in the housing industry towards the eviction moratoriums that have been put in place as a result of the economic shutdown?
Well, I think you saw a number of cities, and you saw the state of California to adopt these eviction moratoriums, and they're very important. It's homelessness prevention. If folks, the minute they lost their job or their income was reduced or their hours were reduced, if they couldn't pay their rent, if they were evicted for non-payment of rent, which they could have been without this eviction moratorium, we would have seen a lot more people who would have lost their housing. And so the eviction moratorium is very important. But again, it's not the rent that they owe still has to be paid at some point. There's the whole other side of the landlords that need to be able to get income in order to be able to maintain their properties. So that's why we and some others have initiated these emergency rental assistance programs to help to pay that back rent. So I think it's a very important homelessness prevention strategy, eviction moratorium.
All right. Well, gentlemen, we have another viewer that has written in on the chat. Charles, I think this question is probably going to be more in your direction. This comes from Dan, and he is asking, is heritage housing like Habitat for Humanity? Can I work on the houses?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we certainly can.
Good. So there's some feedback. I don't know what's going on.
I'm sorry that there's technical difficulties there, and you sound wonderful on this end.
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay, great. So HHP and Habitat are similar in that we're both home ownership programs. They do have the self-help housing feature, which is that you participate in building someone else's home and you earn points, and ultimately it's your turn to become a home buyer. Our program is different, more of a conventional real estate development in terms of how we're financed. They also tend to house folks at lower income levels than we do. About 60% of our units are sold to low income households and about 40% to moderate and middle income households. And I think they're exclusively a low income program.
Habitat, we do work with the Habitat for Humanity San Gabriel Valley chapter. They are an active developer here in Pasadena. They have a project of 2 units to be built on a city-owned site that's going through the permitting process right now. And they built a project in the Arroyo called the Desiderio Homes project. It's a very beautiful courtyard right in the Arroyo, and so they completed that a couple of years ago. So they are an active developer, homeownership developer here.
All right. Do either of you gentlemen feel that the protests and the COVID pandemic will affect future investment in the affordable housing market for both ownership and for rental in the future?
Well, in the governor's proposed budget, there is for next fiscal year, there's a $250 million reduction in funding that was originally committed to build more low and moderate income housing. So the pandemic, mostly the pandemic, but also the pandemic, the economic impact, the reductions, the way it comes to the public sector side, there's less sales, so there's less sales tax, right? There's less people staying in hotels, so there's less hotel tax that is getting paid. And the state went, almost overnight from a surplus budget to a deficit budget. And so there are big reductions there. So affordable housing is done, one of the main ways you produce affordable housing, there's 3 ways to do affordable housing. You either subsidize it, or you incentivize it with something like a density bonus or fee waivers, or you require it with an ordinance like an inclusionary housing ordinance where they have to include some affordable units. So those 3 ways. So the way of subsidizing, we're already seeing some impacts there because there's less money on the public sector side to help to subsidize these developments. So there definitely is an impact there.
Yeah, I'd weigh in. I'm hopeful that while the public sector is maybe pulling back slightly, there may be some more private sector resources for housing as a result of the protests and shining a light on some of the inequities that exist in our society. I think we'll see more focus on, like, for instance, some of the money that the city of LA is thinking about taking from the police department. I'm anxious to see where that goes, and will that go into creating housing opportunities that maybe are not funded by the public sector.
All right. Well, earlier we spoke of the eviction moratoriums that are currently in place during, Bill, what you referred to as the emergency period. But in spite of that level of assistance, it is reasonable to expect that in the end there will still be a high number of evictions. What programs are there to, well, I should say, what other programs are there to try and prevent this outcome? And are there programs to help those who will become the unfortunate and unwilling victim?
Yeah, there are. So we have an eviction moratorium, and we have the city council last year strengthened the tenant protection ordinance, focusing really on large rent increases when a building is sold, when an apartment building is sold, which has been happening. So an apartment that has relatively modest rents might get sold or purchased by an investor who then will raise the rents up significantly. And so there are some protections that were put in place for that specific period. We've also helped to fund the Housing Rights Center, which is a nonprofit organization, deals with tenant-landlord disputes and discrimination issues. And so they opened a new office here in Pasadena. And so there are resources if some landlords are not abiding by the tenant protection ordinance, or not abiding by the eviction moratorium, a renter could connect with the Housing Rights Center, who could help to ensure that the renter knows what their rights are and the landlord knows what the requirements are. We also have homeless prevention programs to help those who are very low income, to help them to stay housed rather than allow them to fall into homelessness and then get them out. So for instance, if somebody is working a minimum wage job with no sick leave, and they get sick, or their child gets sick and they couldn't work for a week or 2 weeks, they don't get paid, right? But they may be back to work, but they owe some, but they're not able to pay their full month's rent. Well, they can connect with a nonprofit, and we work with a couple of nonprofits like Friends Indeed. They can go see Friends Indeed and work out an arrangement where they can get that assistance to pay for that rent, so that they can remain housed and not get evicted, and then try to get then we have to try to get them out of homelessness and back into housing. If they already have housing that they can afford, but they just hit a bump in the road, and life is full of bumps, right? That we can help them get over that bump and remain housed.
All right. Well, we have a couple more questions from viewers at home. So let me pose the first one to you, gentlemen. Mary, viewing at home, writes that her landlord is asking for all kinds of proof that she was fired because of COVID. Does she have to give that to them?
It's for you, Bill.
Yeah, there is there's a fact sheet on our city. If you go to cityofpasadena.net, you go to the housing department website, there are fact sheets in there. There are even some sample forms that she can use to notify her landlord and to find out what the requirements are. And again, ultimately, if she feels that the landlord is not abiding by the eviction moratorium, then I'd advise her to contact the Housing Rights Center here in Pasadena.
Okay. And another viewer, Jackson, posed a question. What's going on with the Space Bank development?
Again, that is a private, from what I know about it, it's a private market rate development that I believe their intention is to comply with our inclusionary housing ordinance. So some of the units there, maybe as high as 15% of the units, would be affordable. But it's a market rate project. I don't know what the status is on that particular project, and that's going through the planning department.
Well, closer to the top of the show, we were discussing the homeless issue and where the numbers first began to explode, and we noted that that traced back to the economic meltdown in 2007, 2008. A lot of that, ironically, to bring the conversation full circle, was traced to the fact that housing costs were basically outpacing income. And the financial industry certainly had a share of blame in that also, by handing out a lot of loans without really uh, taking into consideration a prospective borrower's ability to repay those loans. That having been said, we have now seen an economic shutdown brought on by COVID. Do we, or is there an expectation that there will be another wave of foreclosures like we saw in 2008 as a result of this pandemic?
Uh, One thing I'm seeing is that maybe the mortgage lenders learned a little bit from 2008. Uh, this is more anecdotal than data driven, but I see a lot of different lenders offering forbearance programs that I don't think they offered 10 years, 12 years ago. And forbearance meaning that there's a pause on making mortgage payments until the economy comes back or you have the wherewithal to do that. So I think they're showing a lot more flexibility in terms of helping people, both homeowners as well as the renters, and some of the programs the bill describes stay in their units.
So the outlook is better this time around.
Again, I have a very small snapshot into that, but the answer that from what I see is yes.
Okay. Um, what prevents Heritage Housing Partners from purchasing more land for homes?
Money.
It's just that simple.
Yeah, it's that simple.
All right. Well, that brings up an interesting question then. For both of you gentlemen and your respective organizations, are there ways that the community can get involved and help your organizations to help more people? Donations, manpower. How do they, and if there is, how do they go about getting involved?
Well, we're a nonprofit, so you can make a charitable donation to Heritage Housing Partners. And if you go on our website, I think there's a spot on the website to do that. But
Yeah.
again, talking about $600,000 or $700,000 a unit times 40, 50 unit project, the numbers get really big really fast.
Well, but certainly every little bit can help.
Every
Right.
little bit helps.
Right. Yeah, I'd mention a couple things. I mean, one is the Pasadena is a very active community, and including in the space of affordable housing and homelessness, there's a pretty well organized group of advocates for affordable housing. So I would, connect with some of the existing advocates. Also, there is a program. Speaking of homelessness, there's a program here in Pasadena called Real Change Movement. There are some orange parking meters that have been put up in different places here in Pasadena, and that's an easy way for people to make a contribution. They could contribute coins or use credit card or debit card to make a contribution. They can be part of the solution. That program is run by the Flint Ridge Center here in Pasadena. And that's a good way of making sure that any kind of contribution you make 100% of it goes towards the solution.
All right. That sounds like a very, very
Mhm.
good solution. I hope
Yeah.
people will definitely get involved. We are fast approaching the end of the show. There's only a few minutes left. I would like to take a moment to give each of you gentlemen a chance to perhaps give us any closing thoughts that you might have. I don't know. Perhaps, Charles, how about if we begin with you? Are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to add to the program this evening?
Um, I think the point I would like to make is that the affordable housing, like I said at the beginning, is across a wide spectrum of need. And we can't just rely on the public sector to solve the problem. So I think we have to get more private money, be it in the form of foundations or other kinds of private sources. I think employers need to understand that they have to be in the housing business in order to attract workers to their businesses, or be able to have their workers live near their businesses. And I also think we need to be able to demonstrate that private investors can make money by investing in the middle class in California.
And I guess what I would like to end with is, since we spent a lot of time talking about homelessness, is to recognize that homelessness is a symptom. Homelessness is not a cause, it's a symptom, and it's a symptom of some drivers that are way upstream. And so we have some fundamental shortcomings upstream that push people into homelessness. Our fastest growing segment of our homeless population are seniors. We had a 20% increase. The county overall had a 20% increase in 1 year. There are very large holes in our senior social safety net. The average Social Security payment is about $1,400 a month. Well, that's not enough to maintain your own unit. There's a lack of middle class jobs, there's a lack of access to healthcare, mental health care, rehab programs. There's institutionalized racism. There's educational achievement gaps. These are all drivers that drive people into homelessness. So homelessness is a symptom. So we're trying to treat the symptom as much as possible, but we have to go upstream and address the causes as a society overall. We have to decide we're going to do something about it upstream before people become homeless.
That's very, very good thought. One last quick question before we have to say goodbye. And this is really to help out renters in the community in general. Are there processes in place that a tenant can go to if they have trouble with a landlord, who's not responsive to problems?
Yeah, I think if there's a tenant landlord issue, they can go to the Housing Rights Center. So you can Google them in Pasadena. If it's some sort of lack of repairs or something like that, a sort of blighted condition, they can contact the planning department for code inspection, or the health department if it's a health related issue that's not being addressed.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that information. Gentlemen, I think we've just about run out of time this evening, and certainly homelessness and the housing market and industry are very, very complex situations. They're very complex subjects, and we could spend hours just talking about it. There are so many questions we didn't get to address. Hopefully it's something that we can talk about again in the future. But Mr. Bill Huang and Mr. Charles Loveman, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure. You gentlemen have been wonderful. To our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed in our discussions, you can email them to us at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. That's arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. And we may try to include them in a future broadcast. For now, thank you so much for watching, and good night.
Thank you, Joe.